The email arrived at 6:32 in the morning, which already told me it wasn't meant to be kind. Anything important that shows up before sunrise usually assumes you don't deserve time to prepare. I was standing in my kitchen in Tacoma, Washington, barefoot on cold tile, waiting for the kettle to boil. The house was quiet in that heavy way it gets when you live alone long enough to stop filling silence with noise. I checked my phone out of habit, expecting nothing more than a calendar reminder or a client reschedule. Instead, the subject line stared back at me. Notice of review regarding estate administration. No greeting, no warmth, just procedure. For a moment, I didn't open it. I watched steam curl out of the kettle, listened to the soft click as it shut itself off. I had learned over the years that my body often understood danger before my mind did. My shoulders tightened, my jaw set. A familiar pressure settled behind my eyes, not fear exactly, but alertness. By the time I tapped the screen, I already knew who it was from. My older brother, Daniel. The email was written in the careful, polished language he used when he wanted to sound reasonable, neutral, professional, almost compassionate. He explained that concerns had been raised about how I was handling certain paperwork related to our grandmother's estate. He wrote that as executor, he had a responsibility to ensure everything was done cleanly and transparently. He wrote that he had initiated a formal review. He did not write my name. He referred to me only as the acting administrator. I read the message twice, then a third time slower. Each sentence was technically polite. None of them were accidental. It was the kind of message that sounds harmless if you read it quickly and devastating if you understand what it actually sets in motion. A review meant lawyers. Lawyers meant delay. Delay meant doubt. Doubt meant control slipping out of my hands 1 inch at a time. I was 31 years old. I had been handling the estate for 8 months without issue. I had followed every instruction our grandmother left behind, down to the handwritten notes she tucked into the margins of her will. The accounts were clean, the filings were timely, nothing was missing. But Daniel did not need wrongdoing, he only needed suspicion. I set the phone down on the counter and poured hot water over my coffee grounds, watching them bloom slowly. The smell was grounding, real. I focused on it because if I let my mind run ahead, I would start asking questions that had no immediate answers. Questions like why now? Or why he didn't call? Or why this felt less like concern and more like an ambush? My grandmother Eleanor Walsh had named me executor for a reason. Not because I was the oldest. I wasn't. Not because I lived closest. I didn't. She chose me because I paid attention. Because when she talked about money, about property, about the family business she built from nothing, I listened instead of nodding politely and changing the subject. Daniel used to say I was her favorite. He said it half joking, half bitter, like it explained something unfair about the world. I never corrected him. By the time the coffee was ready, my appetite was gone. I carried the mug to the small dining table and sat down, opening the email again, this time reading it as if I were someone else. As if I were a stranger deciding whether to trust the person being described. That version of me sounded careless, overextended, possibly incompetent, not malicious, just questionable. It was subtle. That was the part most people missed. I scrolled to the end and saw the attachment. A formal notice. A list of requested documents. Deadlines written in calm, unforgiving language. I exhaled slowly and leaned back in my chair. This was not about paperwork. This was about leverage. Growing up, Daniel had always been the reliable one, the one my parents pointed to when they wanted an example. He followed the expected path. Stable job, early marriage, 2 children before 40. He learned early how to sound reasonable even when he was asking for something that benefited only him. I was the one who moved away. The one who didn't come home for every holiday. The one who asked questions that made people uncomfortable, especially when it came to money and fairness. When our grandmother got sick, I was the one who rearranged my life without announcing it. I flew in quietly. I stayed longer than planned. I sat with her during the hours when the rest of the family had already gone home, when the house smelled like old books and lavender and time felt thin. She told me things then, not secrets exactly, but truths people assume don't matter until they do. She told me which parts of the family business were fragile. She told me which accounts existed for reasons no one else knew. She told me she was tired of watching people confuse love with entitlement, When she named me executor, Daniel smiled and hugged me in front of everyone. Later in the kitchen, he said, "That's a lot of responsibility. Don't let it overwhelm you." I remember the way he said it, soft, almost kind. The email on my phone was the continuation of that sentence. I did not reply. That was the first decision. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up my files. Every receipt, every transfer, every notarized document. I organized them again even though they were already organized because order is a form of control when everything else feels uncertain. As I worked, I noticed something else, a small detail that had been easy to overlook until now. The review had been requested through Daniel's attorney, not the estate's, which meant he wasn't protecting the process. He was positioning himself. I closed the laptop and stared at the wall across from me, where morning light cut a pale line through the room. The house felt different now, like it had shifted slightly without moving. The same furniture, the same quiet. But something underneath had changed. This was no longer a family matter. This was a strategy. And I understood with a clarity that surprised me that if I reacted emotionally, if I tried to explain, defend, or reassure, I would lose ground immediately. Daniel thrived in spaces where other people filled the air with words. I had learned something else from my grandmother during those long afternoons. When someone tries to take something from you quietly, the most dangerous thing you can do is interrupt them too soon. I took a sip of coffee. It tasted bitter and strong, grounding me in my body again. The review would move forward whether I liked it or not. That part was already decided. What wasn't decided yet was how much of myself I would give away trying to prove I deserved what had already been entrusted to me. I picked up my phone one more time and opened a blank note. I wrote a single line and saved it. Do nothing until I understand the full shape of the threat. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing on damp pavement. Life moved on, unaware that something small had just cracked open. By the end of the day, other emails would come. Questions from banks. A message from my mother that said, "Your brother is just trying to help." Silence from my father, which would speak louder than anything else. But that morning, sitting alone at my table, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. The letter had not asked permission, and neither would what I did next. By noon, the kettle had gone cold, and my coffee sat untouched on the table, a thin skin forming on top. I hadn't moved much since the email arrived. I wasn't frozen. I was listening. Silence has texture when you stop fighting it. It stretches. It waits. And if you pay attention, it tells you who is moving against you before they ever say your name out loud. The first call came from my mother just after 11. I watched the phone vibrate on the table until it stopped. No voicemail. That alone was unusual. She always left voicemails. Long ones. Gentle ones. Messages that sounded like concern but ended with expectations tucked neatly inside. An hour later, another call. Same number, same silence afterward. I finally picked up on the third attempt, not because I felt ready, but because I needed to hear what version of reality had already been written without me. "Sweetheart," she said immediately, voice tight in that careful way she used when she wanted to sound calm, but wasn't. "I've been trying to reach you." "I know," I said. I kept my voice even, not warm, not cold. There was a pause. I could almost hear her adjusting, recalibrating. "Daniel told us there might be some confusion with the estate paperwork," she said. "He's just trying to make sure everything is done properly. You understand that, right?" There it was, the framing. Not accusation, not blame, just concern. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. Confusion where I asked. Another pause, shorter this time. "Well, I don't know the details," she said quickly. "That's between you and him. I just don't want this to become difficult." Difficult. That word had done a lot of work in our family over the years. It meant don't push, don't ask, don't disrupt the shape of things. "I followed the will exactly," I said. "There's no confusion." "I'm sure," she replied. "But Daniel has always been very thorough. You know how he is." I did know. He was thorough when it served him, methodical when it gave him advantage, and always calm when other people were expected to absorb the discomfort. "I'll handle it," I said. She exhaled, relief audible. "Good. I just hate seeing you two at odds. After everything your grandmother did for this family." Her voice trailed off as if sentiment alone could carry the rest of the sentence. After we hung up, I sat very still. The conversation replayed itself in my head, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. No one had asked me if the review was justified. No one had asked me how I felt reading that email. Concern, I realized, was being used as a substitute for trust. That afternoon, I received a message from the bank requesting clarification on an account freeze. Not a problem yet, just a precaution pending review. But precautions stack, they always do. By evening, my father sent a single-line text. Let's keep this civil. Civil, as if I had thrown the first stone. I didn't reply. Instead, I drove to the storage unit where my grandmother's physical records were kept. The sun was already low, casting long shadows across the concrete lot. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar smell of cardboard and dust and old paper. These were the things no one else wanted to deal with. Handwritten ledgers, old contracts, faded photographs of the original storefront from before the business became profitable enough to brag about. I ran my fingers along the boxes slowly. This was where Eleanor had lived most of her truth. In margins, in notes, in details people dismissed as outdated. I pulled out a small leather-bound notebook she had given me months before she died. You'll know when to read this, she had said. I hadn't opened it yet. I sat on the concrete floor and flipped to the first page. Her handwriting was steady, slanted slightly to the right. Confident, unapologetic. If you are reading this, she wrote, someone is trying to simplify what was never simple. I felt my throat tighten just slightly. She wrote about the business, yes, but she also wrote about the family. About patterns. About how people confuse involvement with entitlement. About how the loudest concern often comes from those most afraid of losing control. One line stood out, underlined twice. Pay attention to who asks questions and who asks for authority. I closed the notebook and sat there for a long moment, letting the concrete chills seep through my jeans. The review wasn't about mistakes. It was about who got to decide what counted as one. That night, I forwarded the review notice to an attorney recommended by a colleague. I didn't add commentary, just a single line. Please advise, I am executor, concerns feel strategic. She replied within an hour. Do not respond yet. Let's talk tomorrow. I slept lightly, dreams fractured and unfinished. When I woke, there was a new email waiting. Daniel again. This one shorter. I hope you're not taking this personally. We both want what's best for the family. I read it once and closed my laptop. The next morning, I met with the attorney in her downtown office. She listened without interrupting as I explained the timeline. When I finished, she leaned back and folded her hands. This is escalation, she said calmly, not resolution. She explained how reviews like this often start, quietly, respectfully, and how if you panic or over-explain, you give the other party the opportunity to adjust their narrative. What do you want? She asked me. I didn't answer right away. I thought about my grandmother's house, about the business, about the years of unspoken assumptions, about how often I had been expected to be flexible while others were firm. I want the will executed as written, I said finally, without interference. She nodded. Then you need to stop explaining yourself to people who are not entitled to explanations. When I left her office, the city felt sharper, louder, more real. I realized something uncomfortable but clarifying. My family didn't believe I was doing something wrong. They believed I should not be the one in charge. That night, I received another call from my mother. I didn't answer. I stood by the window instead, watching headlights pass one after another, each car heading somewhere with certainty. Control doesn't always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in concern, wearing a reasonable voice asking you to step aside for your own good. And the moment you realize that is the moment you understand this is no longer about keeping peace. It's about keeping yourself. I closed the blinds and turned off the lights. Tomorrow I would stop reacting. Tomorrow I would start deciding. The morning I stopped answering calls, the pressure shifted. It didn't disappear. It didn't ease. It changed shape. Silence. I learned unsettles people who are used to being deferred to. When you remove yourself from their narrative, they don't pause. They accelerate. They start filling the quiet with assumptions, then decisions, then actions. By the end of the week, the review had expanded. I found out through a third party, which was intentional. Daniel didn't tell me directly. He didn't need to. The bank clerk's voice was polite but guarded when she called to say an additional account was being temporarily restricted, pending clarification. A vendor emailed asking whether payments would be delayed. A realtor handling one of my grandmother's properties asked whether there had been a change in authority. Each conversation ended the same way. Apologies, neutral phrasing, a suggestion that things would move faster if everyone was on the same page. Everyone except me, apparently. I began to see the pattern clearly then. This was not a confrontation, it was erosion. Small, justifiable steps designed to make my role feel unstable, to make other people uncomfortable working with me, to make the question of my authority feel open-ended. And the longer I stayed quiet, the more confident Daniel became. He sent another email, longer this time, still polite, still careful. He suggested we meet with the family to discuss a temporary restructuring of responsibilities. He used words like collaborative and transparent. He wrote that he worried about the stress I must be under. I read it once, then archived it. That afternoon I drove to my parents' house. I hadn't planned to, but something in me needed to see their faces when no one was performing for an audience. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. Trimmed hedges, neutral paint, a place designed to feel steady. My mother answered the door quickly, as if she had been waiting behind it. "Oh," she said, surprise flickering for just a second before she recovered. "You should have called." "I know," I replied. She stepped aside to let me in. The living room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. Everything was in its place. Nothing had shifted, even though the ground under my feet felt different. My father sat in his chair by the window. He looked up when he saw me, then back down at his hands. We stood there for a moment, the three of us suspended in something none of us wanted to name. "I hear there are concerns," I said finally. My mother clasped her hands together. "Daniel is just trying to help," she said again. The phrase had become a reflex. "Help with what?" I asked. She hesitated. "With managing things, making sure nothing goes wrong." "Nothing has gone wrong," I said. My father cleared his throat. "Sometimes it's not about wrong," he said. "It's about perception." There it was. Perception mattered more than accuracy. Comfort mattered more than consent. "I was named executor," I said. "By Eleanor. Explicitly." My mother flinched slightly at the use of her name. "We know," she said. But maybe she didn't realize how complicated this would be. "She realized exactly what she was doing," I replied. Silence followed. Heavy, loaded. My father finally looked at me. His eyes were tired. "Daniel has a family," he said. "Children. Stability matters." "And I don't?" I asked quietly. No one answered. That was the moment something settled inside me, cold and clear. I was not being evaluated for my competence. I was being measured against how disruptive my independence felt to everyone else. My mother reached for my arm. I stepped back before she could touch me. "I'm not stepping aside," I said. "Not temporarily, not to make things easier." Her mouth tightened. "You don't have to be so rigid." "I do," I said, "because if I'm flexible now, I won't exist in this process at all later." I left shortly after. No shouting, no slammed doors, just a quiet exit that felt heavier than any argument. That evening, my attorney called. "They filed a formal petition," she said, "requesting court supervision of the estate on the grounds of potential mismanagement." I closed my eyes slowly, based on what? "Concern," she said, "and narrative." She explained what would happen next. Court dates, disclosures, time, expense, pressure, all designed to make me tired enough to compromise. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking they assumed I'd panic," I said, "or fold." "And you didn't." "No," I replied. I got quiet. She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "That makes people nervous." After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table again, the same place where the first email had arrived. The house felt smaller now, but not weaker. Sharper, like a space that had finally chosen a side. I opened my grandmother's notebook again and flipped further this time. "There will come a moment," she had written, "when they stop asking and start deciding. That is when you stop explaining." I realized then that the escalation wasn't something to prevent. It was something to allow. Because the more Daniel moved without resistance, the more visible his intentions would become. And visibility, unlike concern, leaves a trail. That night I sent one email. Not to my brother, not to my parents. To the court. A formal notice asserting my role as executor and requesting that all communications regarding the estate be directed through counsel. No emotion, no accusation, just structure. The response came the next morning, brief and procedural. Acknowledgement. Filing recorded. I felt something loosen in my chest, not relief, alignment. They had mistaken my silence for uncertainty. They were about to learn the difference. I turned off my phone and went for a long walk along the water, letting the cold air bite my face, letting my thoughts slow to something steady and deliberate. Control, I understood now, doesn't always arrive by force. Sometimes it arrives by suggestion. And sometimes the most radical thing you can do is refuse to be suggested out of your own life. By the time I returned home, the path ahead was clearer. They had made their move. Now I would make mine. The notice for the family meeting arrived the following Tuesday. Not from Daniel, from my mother. It came as a text, casual in tone, almost friendly. "We're all getting together on Sunday. Just to talk things through. I really hope you'll come." No mention of lawyers, no mention of court filings, no mention of the fact that Daniel had already asked a judge to step in and supervise the estate I was legally appointed to manage. Just talk things through. I stared at the message longer than I needed to. I knew exactly what kind of meeting this would be. I had grown up attending versions of it my entire life. The kind where the outcome was decided in advance, and the conversation existed only to make it feel fair. Still, I replied yes. Not because I believed it would change anything, but because there is value in seeing how far people are willing to go when they think you're still playing by the old rules. Sunday afternoon, I drove back to my parents' house. The driveway was full when I arrived. Daniel's car, his wife's SUV, even my aunt from Portland, the one who liked to say she didn't get involved while repeating everyone else's opinions verbatim. I sat in my car for a moment before getting out. I wasn't nervous. I was observant. There's a difference, and it matters. Inside the house buzzed with forced warmth. Plates already set. Coffee poured. Everyone moving just a little too quickly, as if momentum could replace honesty. Daniel stood when he saw me. He smiled, that same careful expression he'd used in his emails. "Glad you came," he said. "So am I replied. We sat around the dining table, the same one where holidays had been held, where my grandmother used to sit at the head correcting facts gently when people got sloppy with the truth. Her chair was empty now. My mother opened the meeting the way she always did, with concern. She talked about how hard the last few months had been, how emotions were running high, how no one wanted this to turn into something bigger than it needed to be. Daniel nodded along, hands folded, looking every inch the reasonable older brother. When it was his turn, he spoke slowly, deliberately. "I just want to be clear," he said. "This isn't about accusing anyone of wrongdoing. It's about making sure the estate is protected. There are assets here that affect all of us." I noticed how he said all of us, not her wishes. "I've spoken with my attorney," he continued, "and he advised that court supervision might be the safest route. It removes any appearance of bias." "Appearance again," my aunt chimed in. "It just seems like a lot for one person to handle." I let the silence stretch before I spoke. "What exactly do you think I've mishandled?" I asked. No one answered immediately. Daniel cleared his throat. "It's not specific incidents," he said. "It's the structure. You're very independent. That can make people uneasy." There it was. Not wrong, not negligent. Uneasy. "I followed every instruction in the will," I said. "Every one." My mother looked down at her hands. My father stared at the table. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "No one's saying you haven't tried," he said. "But maybe this is bigger than you realized." I smiled then. Not because anything was funny, but because the clarity was almost relieving. "This meeting," I said, "isn't about the estate." They all looked at me. "It's about control," I continued. "You don't like that I was chosen. You don't like that I don't check in for approval. And instead of saying that out loud, you've decided to make the process so uncomfortable that I step aside." Daniel's smile faltered just slightly. "That's not fair," my mother said quickly. "It's accurate," I replied. Daniel's tone hardened. "You're being defensive." "No," I said, "I'm being precise." I reached into my bag and placed a folder on the table. I hadn't planned to bring it, but something in me knew this moment was coming. "These are copies of every filing, every transfer, every receipt," I said. "Reviewed by counsel. Clean." No one reached for the folder. Because the truth was never the issue. "What are you asking me to do?" I asked finally. Daniel exchanged a glance with my parents. Then he said it. "We think it would be best if you stepped back," he said. "Let a neutral administrator take over. Just temporarily. Just temporarily." The phrase landed exactly where it was meant to. "And if I don't?" I asked. The room shifted. My father spoke then quietly. "Then this could get unpleasant." I nodded slowly. "It already has." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "Why are you making this so hard?" she asked. I looked at her, really looked. At the fear behind her concern. At the years she had spent smoothing over discomfort rather than confronting it. "I'm not making it hard," I said. "I'm refusing to disappear." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "If you don't cooperate," he said, "the court will decide." I stood. "I've already spoken to the court," I said, "through counsel. They're aware of my position." His eyes narrowed, just a fraction. "You went around us," he said. "No," I replied. "I went through the process." I picked up my bag and turned toward the door. My mother stood too. "Please," she said, "don't do this." I paused, hand on the doorknob. "You should have asked me not to do this before you tried to take it from me," I said. The drive home was quiet. No music, no phone calls, just the steady hum of the road beneath me. That night my attorney called again. They overplayed their hand, she said. The petition includes statements that contradict the will directly. I closed my eyes. What does that mean? I asked. It means she said this is no longer about supervision. It's about intent. I hung up and sat in the dark, letting that word settle. Intent. They hadn't asked. They had decided. And in doing so, they had crossed a line that could not be smoothed over with concern or family dinners or carefully chosen words. The next step would not be emotional. It would be structural. And once structure moves, feelings stop mattering. That was the moment I understood something else too. I had not been invited to that meeting to speak. I had been invited to surrender. And by walking out, I had given them the one thing they never expected. Resistance without noise. The escalation was complete. Now the consequences would begin. The first official hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the family meeting. It wasn't dramatic. No courtroom, no raised voices. Just a procedural review in a beige conference room on the 4th floor of the county building, the kind of place where decisions are made quietly and then lived with loudly. I arrived early. That was intentional. I wanted to feel the room before anyone else filled it. The long table, the water pitcher placed just off center, the stack of folders already waiting, each one labeled with a name that belonged to my family but no longer felt like mine. Daniel arrived 10 minutes later with his attorney, a man in his mid-40s who shook hands easily and smiled too much. They spoke in low voices as they took their seats across from mine. Daniel did not look at me. My parents came last. They hesitated at the door when they saw me sitting alone on one side of the table. My mother's eyes flicked to Daniel, then back to me, as if trying to calculate where she was supposed to stand. My father nodded once in my direction and sat beside my mother, closer to Daniel than to me. No one said my name, not once. The hearing officer entered promptly at 9. She introduced herself, outlined the purpose of the meeting, and began reviewing the petition. As she spoke, I realized something that made my spine straighten. They weren't talking about me as a person. They were talking about me as a complication. The acting administrator, she said, the individual currently managing the estate, the party whose role is under review. Daniel's attorney nodded along, occasionally interjecting with clarifications. He described concerns. He described discomfort. He described the need for neutrality. He did not describe a single error. I waited. My attorney had told me to. She sat beside me, now silent, her pen resting against her notepad, unmoving. The hearing officer turned to Daniel. Can you clarify what prompted the request for court oversight? Daniel spoke smoothly. He had practiced. We felt it was important to remove any appearance of bias, he said, given the complexity of the assets and the emotional nature of family involvement. The emotional nature, as if emotion had initiated this rather than ambition. The hearing officer nodded and made a note. Then she turned to my mother. Do you share these concerns? My mother hesitated. Her hands twisted together in her lap. She glanced at me, then quickly away. We just want what's best, she said, for everyone. I felt something shift then, not pain, recognition. She wasn't lying. She just didn't include me in her definition of everyone. The hearing officer finally looked at me. Do you wish to respond? My attorney placed a hand lightly on the table. I shook my head once. No, I said. Daniel's attorney raised his eyebrows almost imperceptibly. He leaned back, satisfied. The hearing officer nodded. Very well. Based on the petition, I'm inclined to recommend temporary appointment of a neutral administrator pending further review. My mother exhaled sharply. Relief. My father closed his eyes. Daniel's shoulders relaxed. I said nothing. The hearing ended 15 minutes later. Papers were gathered. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Everyone stood. Daniel finally looked at me then. His expression was calm, composed, almost gentle. This is for the best, he said quietly, as if offering comfort. I met his eyes. For who? He didn't answer. Outside the building, my parents approached me hesitantly. This doesn't mean you are being removed, my mother said quickly. Just adjusted. I nodded once. I understand. My father cleared his throat. We can talk later, he said. Once things settle. Things are settling, I replied, just not the way you expected. They left shortly after, walking beside Daniel and his attorney, their heads bent together. I stood on the steps and watched them go, noticing how natural it looked, how easy it was for them to close ranks. I drove home slowly. The house felt different when I walked in. Not empty, displaced, like furniture that had been shifted slightly without permission. By evening, the official notice arrived. A neutral administrator would be appointed. My authority was suspended pending further evaluation. Suspended, a clean word for being erased without confrontation. I sat at my desk and stared at the letter until the words blurred. 8 months of work, dozens of decisions, hundreds of small acts of care reduced to a procedural pause. I expected anger. What I felt instead was stillness, because something important had happened that morning. They had taken my role, but in doing so, they had also taken responsibility. The administrator would now see everything: the accounts, the history, the handwritten notes Eleanor left behind, the instructions Daniel had never read because he assumed he already knew better. And I was no longer bound by silence for the sake of peace. That night, I opened Eleanor's notebook again. Near the back, a page I hadn't read yet was folded in half. I opened it carefully. "If they remove you," she had written, "it will be because they believe you are done. That is when you begin." I felt my breath catch just once. She had anticipated this. Not the details, but the pattern. The moment where control was mistaken for victory. I picked up my phone and made a single call. Not to my family. To a forensic accountant recommended by my attorney. "I need an independent review," I said, "of everything. Not for defense, for clarity." She agreed without hesitation. When I hung up, the house felt quieter but not weaker. They thought removing my name from the room ended the story. They were wrong. It had only shifted the point of view. And from where I was standing now, no longer obligated to maintain the illusion of harmony, I could finally see the structure underneath everything they had built. And structures once exposed are easy to dismantle. I turned off the lights and went to bed knowing that tomorrow I would stop waiting. The loss of position had freed me, and freedom, I was learning, is far more dangerous than compliance. The administrator introduced herself 2 days later by email. Her name was Margaret Henson. Neutral tone, efficient. She outlined her role, her timeline, and the boundaries of her authority. She asked for access credentials and documentation. She did not ask for opinions. That alone told me she was competent. I forwarded everything without comment. Then I waited. Waiting. When it's deliberate, feels different. It isn't passive. It's observant. I kept working my regular job. I kept my routines intact. I did not ask my attorney for updates. I did not ask the administrator how things were progressing. I knew exactly what Daniel expected. He expected me to spiral, to protest, to argue, to send long emails defending myself. He expected me to fight emotionally so he could frame me as unstable, difficult. Exactly the narrative he had already planted. Instead, I stayed quiet. And in that quiet, I started looking elsewhere. The forensic accountant I'd contacted, a woman named Linda Cho, met me in her office on a gray Friday morning. She was in her early 50s, sharp-eyed, calm, with the kind of confidence that comes from having seen every version of greed dressed up as concern. She didn't ask about family dynamics. She asked for documents. We spent 3 hours going through copies of financial records I had already reviewed a dozen times. She moved slowly, methodically, occasionally stopping to ask a single precise question. Who authorized this transfer? Why was this account dormant for so long? Did anyone else have access to these credentials before you? At first, everything looked exactly as it should have. Clean, logical, orderly. Then she paused. "This is odd," she said, tapping one line on her screen. It was a withdrawal from a holding account tied to one of the older properties. Not large, not dramatic. Something most people would skim past without noticing. "Do you recognize this?" she asked. I shook my head. That account shouldn't have been touched, not until final distribution. She frowned slightly. "The timing's strange. It predates the review." I leaned forward. My pulse didn't spike, it slowed. "Can you trace it?" I asked. She nodded. "Give me a day." That evening I received a text from my mother. "Daniel says this is all getting very expensive." I didn't reply. The next afternoon, Linda called. "That transfer," she said, "was authorized from an IP address linked to your brother's firm." I closed my eyes. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "It's subtle. He moved it through an intermediary account. It looks like a temporary reallocation. But the paperwork isn't consistent with estate protocol." I sat back in my chair. He had already started. Before the review, before the petition, before he claimed concern. "Is it illegal?" I asked. She paused. "That depends on intent. But it is absolutely unauthorized." I thanked her and hung up. For a long moment I just sat there letting the information settle. Not anger, not satisfaction. Confirmation. The review hadn't been about protecting assets. It had been about clearing the path. If I was distracted, if my authority was questioned, if oversight slowed things down in the right places and sped them up in others, small changes could slip through unnoticed. Daniel hadn't moved fast. He'd moved early. 2 days later, Margaret called. "I need to ask you something," she said. Her voice was still neutral, but there was a difference now. Alertness. "Of course," I replied. "There are discrepancies between the petition and the account activity," she said. "Specifically transactions that occurred before court involvement. I want to know if you were aware of them." "I wasn't," I said. "But I believe I know who was." She didn't ask who. She didn't need to. That night, I walked through my house, slowly touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the counter, grounding myself in the physical world. The betrayal no longer felt abstract. It was logistical. My parents didn't call. That told me more than any conversation would have. Silence this time was not strategy. It was avoidance. The next morning, my attorney called. "The administrator has flagged irregular activity," she said. "She hasn't named anyone yet, but she's asked for expanded review." I nodded even though she couldn't see me. "Good." "Daniel's attorney has requested a private meeting," she added. I smiled faintly. "Decline." "Already done," she said. By the end of the week, the tone of communication shifted. Emails became shorter, less confident. The certainty that had underpinned everything began to thin. They had assumed oversight would protect them. They had not considered what oversight would reveal. Late Sunday evening, my mother finally called again. Her voice was unsteady. "Something's wrong," she said. "Daniel says there's been a misunderstanding." I looked out the window at the dark street below. "No," I said quietly, "there hasn't." She didn't respond. I ended the call gently, then sat down at my desk and opened Eleanor's notebook one more time. Near the very end, in smaller writing, she had added a final note. "People who take control too early always forget one thing," she wrote. "They leave fingerprints." I closed the book. The pieces were aligning now, not because I forced them to, but because I had stepped out of the way. They had taken my position. In doing so, they had exposed themselves. And I understood then that the revenge would not come from confrontation. It would come from documentation. From letting the system they trusted so deeply do exactly what it was designed to do when someone misused it. The tables hadn't turned yet, but they were starting to wobble. The first time Daniel sounded unsure was on a voicemail he didn't expect me to hear. He left it late Sunday night, well past the hour he usually reserved for control. I saw the missed call when I woke up Monday morning, his name sitting on my screen like something out of place. He didn't sound angry. That was the difference. "Hey," he said, voice lower than usual. "We need to talk. There's been some confusion with the administrator. I think it's best if we clear this up directly. Call me when you get this." No apology, no explanation. Just urgency. I didn't call him back. By mid-morning, my attorney forwarded me an update from Margaret. The tone had shifted there too. She had completed a preliminary trace of estate transactions dating back 18 months. Not just the period under review. Everything. There were now 3 entries flagged for further explanation. All of them predated my suspension. All of them originated from access points not assigned to me. 2 of them connected to Daniel. The third was more interesting. It linked back to a holding company I barely recognized at first. A small consulting entity with a neutral name. When I looked it up, my chest tightened. Daniel's wife. Not directly, not officially, but close enough to matter. I closed my laptop and sat back, letting the quiet of the house settle around me. The pieces were no longer abstract. They were structural. The narrative Daniel had built depended on one assumption: that I would fight emotionally, that I would try to reclaim my role, that I would make noise. Instead, I had stepped aside and watched him step forward. And in stepping forward, he had reached for things he believed were already his. The phone rang again that afternoon. This time it was my father. I answered. "Your mother is very upset," he said without greeting. "There are questions being asked." "Good," I replied. He sighed. "This is getting out of hand." "No," I said. "It's getting visible." There was a long pause. "Daniel says you're refusing to cooperate," he said. "I've cooperated fully," I replied, "with the process." "That's not what he means," my father said. "I know." He cleared his throat. "If there's been a mistake, it doesn't have to destroy the family." There it was, the first shift in language. Mistake? Not concern, not procedure. Mistake. "I'm not destroying anything," I said. "I'm not doing anything at all." "You could intervene," he said. "Slow this down." I looked at the window again, at the faint reflection of my own face staring back. "Why would I?" I asked. He didn't answer. That evening, Margaret requested a formal interview, in person. I arrived at her office the next morning. She greeted me professionally but without the detachment she'd had before. She offered coffee. She closed the door. "I need to be very clear," she said. "This review has moved beyond routine." I nodded. "There are patterns," she continued. "Access, timing, intent. Someone anticipated oversight and adjusted behavior accordingly." She slid a document across the table. A transaction log, highlighted. "This was executed 2 weeks before the petition was filed," she said, "which suggests premeditation." I didn't touch the paper. "Do you believe I should have been removed?" I asked. She met my eyes. "No." That was the first time anyone in this process had said it out loud. "I believe," she continued, "that your removal created an opportunity for misconduct." I exhaled slowly. "What happens now?" I asked. She folded her hands. "Now the court will need to be informed, and certain parties will need to explain their actions under oath." Under oath. The words settled heavily in the room. "I want you to understand something," she said. "I don't take pleasure in this, but the system is designed to respond to misuse." "I understand," I replied. When I left her office, my phone buzzed again. "Daniel." This time he texted, "Please, this has gone far enough." I stared at the message for a long moment. Then I typed a single reply. "I agree." He responded immediately. "Then help me stop it." I turned the phone face down. Stopping it was no longer an option. Later that night, my mother showed up at my door unannounced. Her eyes were red, her coat still buttoned. "I didn't know," she said as soon as I opened the door. "I know," I replied. She stepped inside, hands trembling. "Your father and I thought this was just about procedure. Daniel said there were risks." I gestured for her to sit. "There were risks," I said, "just not the ones he told you about." She looked at me, then really looked. "Is he in trouble?" "Yes," I said. Her shoulders sagged. "Can you fix it?" she asked softly. That question hurt more than anything else. "No," I said, "and I shouldn't." She covered her face with her hands. I waited. After a long moment, she said, "We raised him to be responsible." "You raised him to be confident," I replied. "Those aren't the same." She didn't argue. When she left, the house felt heavy but honest. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The next morning, my attorney called. "The court has scheduled an evidentiary hearing," she said. "Your brother will be required to testify." I closed my eyes. "Good," I said. There was nothing left to manage, nothing left to smooth over. The direction had changed. And it had changed because I had refused to chase control. I had let it reveal itself. The system was moving now not in anyone's favor, but in service of the truth. And the truth, once in motion, does not ask permission to arrive. The evidentiary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning early enough that no one could pretend it was an afterthought. I arrived 15 minutes before the time listed on the notice, not because I needed to prepare, but because I wanted to see the room empty. Rooms like that tell the truth when no one is performing. It was larger than the conference space we'd used before, with high windows and a long table that forced people to face one another without the buffer of comfort. A court reporter sat quietly in the corner, adjusting her equipment. The administrator, Margaret, arranged her files with careful precision. My attorney nodded to me and took her seat. Daniel arrived last. He looked different. Not unkempt, not disheveled. But the ease was gone. The calm certainty he wore like a tailored jacket no longer fit. He scanned the room before sitting, his eyes landing on me for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. He did not smile. His attorney leaned in to whisper something. Daniel nodded once sharply. My parents arrived together and sat behind him. My mother's hands were clasped tightly in her lap. My father stared straight ahead, as if focusing on a single point might keep everything else from collapsing. The hearing officer entered. Formalities were observed. The record was opened. Then Margaret began. She did not dramatize. She did not editorialize. She laid out facts the way someone does when they know emotion will only distract from what matters. Dates, amounts, access logs, authorizations that didn't align with roles. She spoke about patterns, about timing, about behavior that shifted before oversight was requested, not after. Daniel's attorney objected once, then stopped. Because objection doesn't work when the foundation is documentation. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he stood slowly. He adjusted his jacket. He cleared his throat. "I want to be clear," he began. "At no point did I intend to misuse estate funds. Any transfers were temporary reallocations made in good faith to address liquidity concerns." Margaret didn't react. The hearing officer looked down at her notes. Liquidity concerns related to which obligation, she asked. Daniel hesitated. His attorney stepped in. The estate includes several illiquid assets, he said smoothly. There was concern about short-term cash flow. And yet Margaret said, her voice calm, the transfers were made to accounts not designated for estate holding, and in one case, routed through an entity associated with your spouse. The room shifted. My mother inhaled sharply. My father's head dropped. Daniel's face flushed. That's a mischaracterization, he said. The entity was used for consulting purposes only. For the estate, the hearing officer asked. No, Daniel admitted, but it was expedient. Expedient. The word hung in the air, thin and exposed. Did you disclose these actions when filing the petition for court supervision? The hearing officer asked. Daniel opened his mouth. Closed it. No, he said. Silence followed, heavy, unavoidable. Margaret spoke again. It's important to note, she said, that these actions occurred while Ms. Walsh was still acting executor without her knowledge and prior to any formal concerns being raised. The hearing officer turned to me. Do you wish to respond? I stood slowly. I didn't look at Daniel. I didn't look at my parents. I looked at the table. No, I said, I don't. The simplicity of it seemed to unbalance the room more than any accusation would have. Daniel's attorney attempted to reframe. He spoke about misunderstanding, about complexity, about intent versus impact. Margaret waited until he finished. Then she slid one final document forward. This is a comparison of access logs before and after Ms. Walsh's removal, she said. The pattern suggests increased activity and risk once oversight was shifted away from her. The implication was clear. Removing me had not protected the estate. It had exposed it. The hearing officer leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. I am recommending immediate suspension of Mr. Walsh's involvement in estate-related decision-making pending further review, she said. Additionally, this matter will be referred for investigation of potential breach of fiduciary duty. My mother made a small sound barely audible. Daniel stared at the table. His jaw worked as if he were chewing through something he hadn't expected to taste. The hearing concluded without drama, no raised voices, no final speeches, just consequences. Outside the building, the air felt colder than it should have. My attorney walked beside me for a few steps, then stopped. You did exactly what you needed to do, she said. I didn't do anything, I replied. She smiled faintly. Exactly. My parents approached slowly. My mother reached for my arm and stopped herself halfway as if unsure she still had permission. We didn't know, she said again. I know, I replied. My father looked at me, then really looked as if seeing me for the first time without Daniel standing between us. You could have stopped this earlier, he said. Yes, I agreed, I could have. Why didn't you, he asked. Because it wasn't mine to stop, I said. It was his to explain. Daniel exited the building alone. His attorney spoke quickly, urgently, walking a step behind him. He did not look back. That was the moment I understood something else. This wasn't revenge. It was gravity. Actions once released fall where they must. That night I sat at my kitchen table again, the same place where the first email had arrived. The house felt different now. Not smaller, not larger. Honest. I opened Eleanor's notebook one last time. Near the very end she had written a single sentence. When the story collapses, let it. I closed the book and set it aside. The next phase would not be loud. There would be investigations, reports, quiet conversations behind closed doors. But the narrative that had once painted me as a complication had already dissolved. And what remained was something far more solid than vindication. Agency. I turned off the light and went to bed knowing the hardest part was already over. The truth had been placed in the room. Now everyone else would have to decide how to live with it. The days after the hearing were quieter than I expected. No calls from reporters, no dramatic confrontations, no sudden apologies arriving wrapped in urgency. The system did what it always does when something breaks in a way that cannot be ignored. It went procedural. Letters arrived in the mail with official seals and neutral language, notices of investigation, requests for documentation, timelines measured in weeks instead of emotions. Daniel's name appeared in these letters less and less as mine appeared again, gradually, carefully, like something being restored rather than handed back. Margaret called me 2 days later. The court has approved reinstating you as executor, she said, effective immediately. I closed my eyes. Thank you, I said. You should know, she added, this is no longer a family matter. It hasn't been for some time. I know, I replied. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed and let the weight of that settle. Being reinstated didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a responsibility returning to its rightful place after being misplaced. I went back to the storage unit that afternoon. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that flattens everything into soft edges. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, pulling the light cord. The familiar hum filled the space. I opened Eleanor's box again, this time with purpose. Now that the noise had quieted, I could finally do what I was meant to do from the beginning. Finish the work, cleanly, without interference. As I sorted through documents, I found a thin envelope tucked between two binders. It was unmarked, except for my name written in Eleanor's careful hand. Inside was a letter. I didn't tell anyone else this, she wrote, because it wasn't theirs to carry. She explained that she had suspected Daniel would challenge the will. Not because he was cruel, but because he believed too deeply in his own judgment. She had anticipated that control once tasted would feel like entitlement. She wrote that she trusted me not because I was perfect, but because I knew how to wait. People think action is strength, she wrote. Sometimes strength is allowing others to reveal themselves fully. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, my hands steady. That evening, my mother called again. I let it ring twice before answering. She sounded tired, older. I spoke with Daniel, she said. He's not himself. I waited. He says he never meant for this to happen, she continued, that it all got out of control. It didn't, I said quietly. It unfolded. She sighed. He's facing consequences. Yes, I replied. There was a long pause. Then softly, are you? The question surprised me. No, I said after a moment, I'm facing clarity. She didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was thinner. Your father thinks we should give him time. I'm sure he does, I said. What do you think, she asked. I looked around my living room, at the life I had built without asking for approval, at the calm that had settled into the space. I think time doesn't fix patterns, I said. Distance does. She didn't argue. The next week passed slowly. I resumed distributions according to the will. I signed documents. I met with accountants and attorneys. Everything moved forward the way it always should have. Daniel did not contact me again. Instead, a letter arrived from his attorney, brief and formal, stating that he would no longer be involved in estate matters and that all communication should go through counsel. I read it once and set it aside. That chapter was closed. Not with forgiveness, not with bitterness, with finality. One evening I stood on my porch as the sun dipped behind the trees, the air cool against my skin. I thought about how easily I had once equated family with obligation, how often I had accepted discomfort as the price of belonging. I understood now that what I had mistaken for love was often management. And management, when disguised as care, is one of the hardest things to name. My phone buzzed. A text from my father. We're proud of how you handled yourself. I stared at the message for a long moment. It came too late to change anything, but not too late to reveal something important. Pride, when offered after the danger has passed, costs very little. I typed back one sentence. I handled myself the way I had to. Then I put the phone down. The estate would close in time. Assets would transfer. Accounts would zero out. Records would be archived. But the shift that mattered most had already happened. I no longer felt responsible for holding the family together. That weight had never been mine to carry. And as the evening settled into night, I felt something I hadn't expected at the end of all this. Not triumph. Relief. The kind that comes when you stop standing in the doorway of a life you've outgrown and finally step fully into the one that's yours. The quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was earned. Once the estate moved into its final phase, the world seemed to slow down around it. That surprised me. I had expected everything to rush forward once my role was restored, as if momentum had been waiting for permission. Instead, the work became quieter, more deliberate. I realized later that this was what stability actually felt like when it wasn't being interrupted by other people's agendas. I spent long mornings reviewing documents in natural light, the windows open just enough to let in the sound of birds and passing cars. Each signature, each transfer, each confirmation felt less like a task and more like a closing gesture. Not a victory lap, a release. Margaret checked in once more before stepping away completely. She was efficient as always, but there was a softness in her tone that hadn't been there before. You handled pressure well, she said. Most people mistake restraint for weakness. I used to, I replied. She paused. You don't anymore? No, I didn't. The day I finalized the distribution schedule, I drove to my grandmother's house one last time. The property had already been prepared for sale, but I still had the keys. I walked through the rooms, slowly touching nothing, letting memory do its quiet work. The kitchen still smelled faintly of old wood and lemon oil. The living room windows caught the light the way they always had in the late afternoon. For a moment, I could almost hear her voice correcting someone gently, firmly, without apology. In the back bedroom, I opened the closet where she kept the things she never wore but never threw away. Coats from other decades. Shoes polished long after they stopped fitting her life. People talk about letting go as if it's a single act. It isn't. It's a series of choices. I kept one thing, a small silver bracelet she wore every day. Simple, unadorned. It had been resting in a velvet box on her dresser. She had once told me it reminded her that strength didn't need decoration. Everything else would go. That night, my parents invited me to dinner. The invitation came through my father, not my mother, and it was worded carefully. No expectations, no pressure, just an offer. I thought about it for a long time before replying. In the end, I said yes. The house felt different when I arrived. Quieter, smaller, as if the absence of tension had left behind a vacuum no one knew how to fill. My mother hugged me, tentative. My father poured wine without asking if I wanted any. Old habits linger. Daniel wasn't there. No one mentioned him. We ate politely. Spoke about neutral things, the weather, a neighbor's renovation, the price of groceries. It felt like a rehearsal for something that might never be performed again. Halfway through the meal, my mother reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not for believing him, not for staying silent, just sorry." I nodded. It was enough. My father cleared his throat. "We should have trusted you," he said. "Yes," I replied. He didn't argue. When I left that night, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because things were repaired, but because they were no longer being negotiated. Boundaries had a way of simplifying relationships. The following week, I received confirmation that the investigation into Daniel's actions would continue independently. I wasn't required to participate further unless requested. That suited me. What happened to him was no longer my concern. One evening, as I was organizing my files, I found an old calendar from the year my grandmother died. Notes scribbled in the margins, appointments, small reminders. On the final page, she had written something I hadn't noticed before. Know when to hold, know when to walk away. They are not opposites. I closed the calendar and sat back, absorbing the truth of it. Holding on to my role had required walking away from the version of family that demanded silence. Walking away from managing their emotions had allowed me to hold on to my integrity. The estate would close within weeks. The legal work would end. Life would move on. But the shift inside me felt permanent. I no longer felt the need to explain my choices. I no longer felt the pull to soften truths for the sake of comfort. And for the first time, I understood that choosing myself wasn't an act of rebellion. It was maintenance. The kind that keeps the structure standing long after the noise dies down. As I turned off the light and prepared for bed, I realized something else. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant remembering clearly without distortion. And clarity once earned doesn't fade. It stays. Quiet, solid, unapologetic. The closer the estate came to closing, the more clearly I could see the outlines of what would remain after everything else fell away. Distance has a way of sharpening perception. When the noise stops, when no one is calling to argue or explain or negotiate, you start noticing patterns that were always there, but blurred by obligation. Daniel did not reach out, not once. At first, I wondered if he was waiting for forgiveness, for an opening, for someone to soften the situation for him the way it always had been softened before. Then I realized something quieter and more precise. He was waiting for someone else to fix it. That someone had always been me. The last legal documents were scheduled for signing on a Friday morning. I arrived at my attorney's office early, sat in the same chair I had occupied months before when everything still felt uncertain, and signed my name with steady hands. Each signature felt final, not heavy, just complete. When it was done, my attorney closed the folder and slid it aside. "That's it," she said. "The estate is officially closed." I sat there for a moment longer than necessary. "That was clean," I said. She smiled slightly. "That's because you didn't compromise." On the drive home, I passed streets I hadn't noticed in years. Small shops, quiet parks, places that existed regardless of what was happening inside my family. It struck me how much of my emotional energy had once been tied to dynamics that were never mine to control. That afternoon, my father called. I answered. "We heard the estate is finalized," he said. "Yes," I replied. He paused. "Your mother wanted me to tell you she's relieved." I nodded, though he couldn't see it. "And Daniel," he added carefully, "is struggling." I waited. "He feels misunderstood," my father continued. Like things got out of hand. Things don't get out of hand on their own, I said. Silence followed. I'm not asking you to fix anything, he said finally. I just thought you should know. I already do, I replied. After we hung up, I sat by the window and watched the late afternoon light shift across the floor. The house felt settled now, like it had adjusted to the absence of constant vigilance. A few days later, a letter arrived in the mail. Handwritten. Daniel's. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit on the table for a full day untouched. Not because I was afraid of what it said, but because I no longer felt compelled to rush toward his version of closure. When I finally opened it, the letter was shorter than I expected. He wrote that he never meant to hurt anyone. That pressure had made him act quickly. That he hoped in time I would understand. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge the choices he made. He did not ask how I was. I folded the letter neatly and placed it back in the envelope. Then I put it in a drawer. Some things don't deserve a response. That evening, my mother sent a message asking if I would come by for Sunday dinner again. No pressure, no explanation. I thought about it, then declined. Not out of anger. Out of awareness. I wasn't ready to step back into a space where silence had once been mistaken for harmony. And I didn't need to prove anything by returning too soon. Instead, I spent Sunday afternoon walking along the water, the air cool, the sky wide and indifferent in the best possible way. I sat on a bench and watched families pass, couples argue quietly, children run ahead without looking back. I realized then that I had stopped bracing myself, stopped anticipating the next demand, stopped scanning conversations for hidden expectations. That kind of freedom doesn't announce itself. It just shows up one day and stays. On my way home, I stopped at a small bookstore and bought a journal. Nothing fancy. Plain cover, thick pages. That night I wrote the first line. I am no longer available for relationships that require me to disappear. The words felt solid on the page. True. As I closed the journal and set it on my nightstand, I understood something that had taken years to learn. Distance doesn't mean you don't care. It means you finally care enough about yourself to stop negotiating your dignity. The story that once revolved around inheritance, control, and betrayal had reached its natural end. What came next would be quieter, stronger, and entirely my own. The first morning after everything was finished, I woke without urgency. No documents waiting to be reviewed, no calls to anticipate, no subtle tension humming beneath the surface of my thoughts. The quiet felt unfamiliar at first, like a room after furniture has been moved out, but before anything new has been brought in. I made coffee and stood by the window watching the neighborhood wake up. A woman walked her dog past my house. A delivery truck stopped at the corner. Ordinary life moved forward without asking what I had survived to get here. That was when it finally sank in. The crisis was over. Not paused, not managed. Over. For weeks, my identity had been shaped by reaction, by restraint, by staying composed while other people tested how much they could take without asking. Now that there was nothing left to respond to, I felt a strange sense of openness. Not relief, exactly. Possibility. Later that morning, I received one final email from my attorney, confirming that all matters related to the estate were closed, archived, and complete. No further action required. I stared at the words for a moment, then closed my laptop. I did not need to reread them. The truth had already settled where it belonged. In the days that followed, I noticed small changes in myself. I stopped explaining my schedule. I stopped justifying my choices. When people asked questions that felt invasive, I answered them briefly or not at all. The reflex to smooth things over had faded without effort, as if it had only existed to survive a situation that no longer applied. My parents respected the space I asked for, perhaps because they finally understood it wasn't negotiable. We spoke occasionally, carefully, without pretending nothing had happened. Daniel did not contact me again, and for the first time that absence did not feel heavy. It felt appropriate. One afternoon, I returned to the storage unit one last time, not to sort or organize, but to empty it. The unit echoed as I carried out the final box and closed the door behind me. I stood there for a moment, key in hand, listening to the lock click into place. That sound felt ceremonial, not because it marked an ending, but because it marked ownership. Of my time, of my boundaries, of my life moving forward without constant negotiation. That evening, I sat down with my journal and reread the line I had written days earlier. I am no longer available for relationships that require me to disappear. I added another sentence beneath it. I choose clarity over comfort. It felt complete. Looking back now, I understand that the most painful part of the entire ordeal wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the realization that the love I had been offering freely had always come with conditions attached. Be agreeable. Be flexible. Be quiet. Don't disrupt the narrative. Those rules had never been spoken aloud, but they had shaped every interaction. And the moment I stopped following them, everything else unraveled. Not because I was wrong, but because the structure depended on my silence. The revenge people imagine is loud, confrontational, public. Mine wasn't. Mine was choosing not to intervene when the truth began to surface. Mine was refusing to carry consequences that weren't mine. Mine was letting the system respond exactly as it was designed to when someone tried to bend it for personal gain. And then walking away, without trying to reclaim what had never truly belonged to me in the first place. I didn't win by taking something from them. I won by taking myself back. There is a kind of peace that comes when you stop waiting for understanding from people who benefit from misunderstanding you. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It just settles in quietly and stays. Today, my life is smaller in some ways. Fewer obligations, fewer forced gatherings, fewer conversations that require translation. But it is also cleaner, stronger, honest. I don't measure my worth by how well I maintain other people's comfort anymore. I don't confuse love with control. I don't mistake endurance for loyalty. If there is one lesson this experience burned into me, it is this. You don't owe access to people who confuse your silence with permission. You don't owe loyalty to systems that require you to disappear to function. And you don't need revenge when dignity is enough. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step back, say nothing, and let the truth finish the work for you. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt pushed aside by the very people who claim to love you, I'd like to hear from you. Tell me in the comments what choosing yourself looked like in your life. And if you want to hear more stories about boundaries, justice, and the quiet kind of payback that actually lasts, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with me. Some stories don't end when the conflict is over. They begin when you finally choose yourself.